Blog Talk Radio.
People say to me, I wonder what it'd be like to be on a spaceship. And I say to you, you don't really realize what you're doing. Because everybody is an astronaut. You all live aboard a beautiful little spaceship called Earth. With some final examination as to whether human beings who qualify to take on the responsibility we desire to be entrusted with. And this is not a matter of examination of the types of governments, nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with the economic system. It's to do with the individual. Does the individual have the courage to really go along with the truth? I'm not trying to imitate nature. I'm trying to find the principles she's using. To find out what needs to be done. How do you organize yourself to accommodate going from 1% of humanity to 99% of humanity who are now going to have to live? And that is the design responsibility. Therefore, the only way we can possibly take care of our body is through a design revolution, doing more with less. How do we, within that big context, find out how we use our mind, our experience, and to its highest advantage for the others in the shortest possible time? That was a challenge. Take care of all of humanity at a higher standard of living without having anybody profit at the expense of another, so everybody can enjoy the whole earth.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Independence Day in America, July 4th, CZM Global Radio Show. I'm your host, Bakari Pace, and I should be with you for the next 2 hours, maybe less. So there's a couple things that I'm going to get through, and after we get through all of that, I'm going to go into the interview that I had with Will Elkins of the Buckminster Fuller Institute. So a couple things I want to talk to you about right off the bat before we get into there. So there's a couple people inside of the movement who are doing a couple projects that I think need to be a little bit more prominent, get a little bit more attention inside of there. So one, Federico Pistono, one of the coordinators in Italy, is releasing his first book called Robots Will Steal Your Job, But That's Okay, How to Survive the Economic Collapse and Be Happy. Really good book. It's got a lot of attention. He has a website for it and everything. I think you should check him out. The next thing is a friend of mine named Colin Colbreth, who's releasing his book. He's another member of the Zeitgeist movement. His book is called The Lens of Truth. He's doing a really good thing with his book. He's releasing it on the internet for free and letting people add to it in terms of their comments. He wants that type of feedback. Really cool quote from his book. He says, essentially, what is created by capitalism is class separation. Critics will begin to cite at this point that capitalism offers people financial incentives in exchange for ingenuity, and thus will be satisfied with the explanation that the other person missed an opportunity to earn money. In other words, both people had an equal chance to come up with the idea and sell that idea, then thus convert their idea into profit. This capitalistic idea of competition is generally accepted by everyone, simply put, as the way it is. This is, of course, not the way that it has to be. It's just the way the system we were born into is designed to work. This whole section is called Money and Greed, and it's available lensoftruth.org, if I'm mistaken. The next thing is Jazz Priest is another person who's done a book. His book is called The First Civilization, and actually he has a great quote inside of his book. I think someone posted it to the Facebook page. He says, "Unfortunately, no amount of political or economic reform that will allow us to solve the majority of problems caused by our current system, because this system is built on a fundamentally flawed foundation, a foundation that cannot be corrected without a complete overhaul of our entire society. The foundation I speak of is inequality. A system in which all people are forced into competition with each other is one that will invariably lead to social stratification. Some people will be very rich and have much more than what they need, and some will just be barely able to acquire the resources they need for survival, and some will not be able to survive at all. We saw in the previous section that inequality is responsible for the prominence of virtually every social problem that one could think of, whereas equality leads to the near universal improvement of these social problems. Therefore, it is in the best interest of any society that is actually concerned about the well-being of its inhabitants to maximize equality as much as possible. One could even say that the single most foolish and irresponsible thing a society could possibly do is encourage inequality. Unfortunately, inequality is a foundational aspect of our current system." That was Jazz with his book, The First Civilization. And on this track, I would like to urge people who are in school right now, or just people who have a real interest in what we're talking about, to begin writing. The blog.thezeitgeistmovement.com is a great place for you to be able to exercise your writing skills and be able to communicate these ideas to an audience that's actually very much interested in hearing what you have to say. So go to blog.thezeitgeistmovement.com, submit articles, all of that, those ideas that you have. That way we can grow our literature base, which will simultaneously help other people as they're on their way to learning more information like this. As I did last time that I was here with you back in May, I believe, I had a recommended reading list. I will read off those books again. I have the TZM recommended reading list. Chris Anderson with Free, Bellamy, Looking Forward, Brown, Web of Debt, Burke, A Grammar of Motive, Chase, The Tyranny of Words, Chenoweth, Why Civil Resistance Works, Drexler, Engines of Creation, Ford, Lights in the Tunnel, Ferrier, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Fresco, of course, The Best That Money Can't Buy, Buckminster Fuller, Critical Path, Buckminster Fuller, Grunch of Giants, Gilligan, Violence, Reflections on a National Epidemic, Martin Luther King, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, Alfie Kahn, No Contest, The Case Against Competition, Alfred Korzybski, Science and Sanity, Jock Loeb, The Mechanistic Conception of Life, Bill McDonough, Cradle to Cradle, John McMurtry, The Cancer Stage of Capitalism, John McMurtry, The Value Wars, George Orwell, Politics in the English Language, John Perkins, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, Daniel Pink, Drive, The Surprising Science of Motivation, Jeremy Riskin, The End of Work, Jeremy Riskin, The Empathetic Civilization, Ross, The Leaderless Revolution, Robert Sapolsky, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, B.F. Skinner, Science and Human Behavior, Thorstein Veblen, The Engineers and the Price System, Thorstein Veblen, The Theory of the Leisure Class, White, Crimes Against Logic, Richard Wilkinson, The Spirit Level, Why Greater Equality Makes Society Stronger. So that's the book list that we ran through last time that we were here. Next up, I'm going to talk to some of the coordinators and people who are getting involved. We had our U.S. meeting of all the coordinators earlier this week on Monday, and a big topic, of course, is the Zeitgeist Movement Media Festival. The main event is in Los Angeles, August 5th. A good friend of mine actually is going to be performing. His name is Johnny Hobbs, my man from New York City. Here's a little bit of his music here.
Gone all the days of the colonized times, but left all the battles of the colonized mind, a redesign of some kind. Must say it's about time for the zombies to become human again, or maybe it's too late. People have sealed their fate, self-interest overwhelmed, peace pushed to another realm, lost in the redundancy, constant pursuit of currency, seen as something that's great. I wonder what does it take for spirits to reconnect, break out of prisons or kept in awareness beyond before it's be reached and free reset, released by all the dead, but we endure regret for our actions, so let's instead leave it for those up next. And here we are, or by all, understood by few, recited by many, words of a generational burden so heavy, strength is a rarity. You wonder how we manage to carry through the pen and the pad, the pain becomes therapy. Your fist, you see your fist, you see your fist in the air, yes, the fist, I love it. Your fist in the air, you see how easy it is to write us off when we rewrite history. Revolutions popped off and we become that force that we've been waiting for. We've been waiting for.
That was my man Johnny Hobbs, New York City's. He's part of the New York City Zeitgeist chapter. This is his performance at Z-Day 2012 NYC. Really good artist. He'll be performing at August 5th in LA at the main event Zeitgeist Media Festival. So for people, if you're a coordinator, get that underway. Make sure that you have your media festival. It doesn't matter as always. It doesn't matter if it's big. It doesn't matter if it's small. It's just to get that community aspect in, everybody coming together, doing their work, and just enjoying artistic expression in the most beautiful way possible. The second thing I want to talk about is a campaign that my chapter, the Zeitgeist Movement, Georgia, U.S., started. What we began was we were considering was how do we get the most amount of people interested, or how do we get the most amount of people to be funneled in a sort of passive activism way into our chapter. So what we began was a campaign that we called What Zeitgeist Addendum. So what we did basically over the last couple months was to get together a very simple project. And what was really cool about this project is that we were able to connect with all of our members from all across the state. And Georgia's a big state with many of our members are scattered about. It's not an infrastructure for moving people as quickly as possible around so that we can always meet. But however, we had access to our Facebook accounts, which allowed us to be able to communicate very quickly and show our support with each other. So what we did was we created this blueprint of a flyer that simply said, Watch Zeitgeist Addendum. Just those 3 words, nothing else on the flyer, no links, no nothing. And just a very basic flyer. And we would get people, we would send that message out to all of our members. And what they would do is they would print out about 10 copies, as many copies as they want, but 10 copies at the least. And they would post those up at different places all across their city. Just those 3 words. It brought a lot of attention to who were these people and what they're walking around talking about it. They're walking past these signs. And we put them in the most audacious places possible. You see them inside of train stations. You see them inside of grocery stores. One of our members went to the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta and put his flyer right on this Federal Bank thing. Of course, it didn't stay there much longer than a day. But it was really cool just to see all of us participating in that. And the way we were able to see each other participate is what we did was after we did the flyers, we would ask people to take a picture of their flyer and post it into the group page. All across the state, people are posting and sending pictures and saying, this is what I'm doing. They had college students from all around considering this project is not an expensive project. It's just 10 flyers. Nothing too audacious. So people would just come in, take their pictures, put them into the group page, and all of a sudden you saw this viral reaction from within the movement of people participating sporadically in a fun, easy to do guerrilla marketing practice, actually, very simple like that. But our campaign had 2 stages. The second part of the stage, because what we did this over the last summer. After the summer ended, we went to we went onto the college campuses, and we put a very simple flyer on those college campuses. We said, have you seen Zeitgeist, either addendum or moving forward? Meet us at blah, blah, blah. Nothing else on the flyer. The reason why we did that way was because if people had seen the film, they would be interested in meeting people who are interested in this film. And that was very clearly communicated on that flyer. Very simple words. If you've seen Zeitgeist addendum, meet us here. Now, once we had college students who were saying that they self-identified with the Zeitgeist movement, meaning we didn't have to badger anybody, they came on their own. We didn't have to send them a whole bunch of Facebook invites or anything like that. They came on their own. We now had a presence on that college campus of people who were identifying with the Zeitgeist movement. What that affords us then is the ability to hold meetings, to hold events, all of that on that campus, which gives legitimacy to the movement when we're on campus. So instead of saying meet us at the park, that's where we're going to be meeting, you could say meet me at NYU or meet me at Georgia Tech. That's where our Zeitgeist movement meetings are. And because you have a student and a faculty member who is identifying and saying this is a social movement that's a part of our college, then you're able to use the resources of that college, which makes it easier for event planning, makes it easier for meeting planning, and all side, and also gives legitimacy to the way you look. So that's a very, very easy way to get some support and get some attention for your movement. Doing this little guerrilla marketing tactic, and also getting a presence on your college campuses, so that would make it a lot easier. So I think that's about it for me. Oh, there was a couple questions that people had asked me to ask the Buckminster Fuller Institute when I was there. The issue was some of them I did not see till very late, and except for one, Jen, U.S. coordinators, I did not think to ask the question until after the interview. So her question was, who are the people who influenced Buckminster Fuller? And Will said that Einstein. He was very interested in what Einstein's work was. Just like Jacques Fresco, Alfred Korzybski, I always mess that name up, who wrote Science and Sanity, one of his major influences. Surprisingly enough, Henry Ford was a very big influence on Buckminster Fuller's thinking. He thought that Henry Ford was a genius, and really looked at his work. And as a contrasting figure, a person who I was introduced to from Bill McDonough's work, Cradle to Cradle, was a guy named Thomas Malthus, who was a professor at the East India Company College. And he was the first person to do and just like what we're advocating, he was the first person to do have a complete inventory of the world's resources. Because at this point in time, when he's a professor, the British nation is the dominant superpower all over the world, and they have their influence in their hand in most of the nations. So therefore, they were able to do a complete inventory of what was on the planet. Of course, there were degrees of misinformation and things that were off and not adjusted for, considering they did not have advanced computer technology. However, he was the first person to see that information. But his perspective was, instead of saying that now we know what we have, now let's try to deal heavily in resource allocation, his perspective was that if the population keeps growing in this way, we're going to run out of resources. This is the end. He was basically a doomsday prophet. And Buckminster Fuller did not like that attitude at all. And he worked his entire life to try to reverse that conception in the public zeitgeist, and to make them realize that you are billionaires on this planet, that every single person on this planet is a billionaire. They just are ignorant of their riches. So with that said, I'm going to go and play our interview, the interview I did with Will Elkins, and let you get an opportunity to be introduced to Buckminster Fuller from people at the Buckminster Fuller Institute.
Ready the rest of the, I guess.
All right, welcome to the TZM Global Radio Show. I'm here at the Buckminster Fuller Institute in Brooklyn, New York. My guest here is Will Elkins. He's a staff member at the Buckminster Fuller Institute. Welcome, Will.
Thank you. How you doing?
I'm doing well. All right, so tell me a little bit about the Buckminster Fuller Institute, how it was founded, and your role inside the Buckminster Fuller Institute.
Okay, so the Institute has been around since 1983. Actually was founded right before he passed away by friends and family, and it actually kind of started as a continuation of his office out of Philadelphia. And when Fuller passed away, the main job of the Institute was really kind of continuing his archives. Bucky has one of the largest personal archives on record, and so for a number of years their main job was to be the custodians of that archive, and so allow academics or anybody to come in and access them. But it's a huge amount of information and books and resources. He basically kept everything that he ever touched.
That sounds like the Dymaxium chronophile?
The chronophile is part of it, and the chronophile was this leather-bound series of books where every note he had written down, and even just receipts from the dry cleaners, a lot of stuff. And so it was a leather-bound series of books, and it's about, I think it's about as long as a football field when it's all just the books themselves laid out.
That's incredible.
So that's only part of the archive. There's all these other models, and there's other boxes of stuff that didn't make it into the chronophile. So his archive is pretty large. So the Institute was in California for a number of years, in LA, Santa Barbara, and then eventually Sebastopol, which is in Northern California. And up until about 1999, the main role was really being the custodians of that archive. And then in 1999, they brokered a deal with Stanford, so the archives are there at Stanford University. So if anyone is, highly recommend you go check them out.
To Stanford, that's really cool.
You can't really see the whole thing at once, but you can check out certain boxes, and it's a pretty cool experience.
Is any available online?
Yes, and they have it's a great question. They have a huge archive that's digital stuff, so some videos and audio files on the Stanford library website.
So just go to stanford.edu, type in Buckminster Fuller?
Yeah, if you do a Google search, you can find it. You can also, there's a link from our website as well.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about the BFI.org website? Like for people who are interested, they go to the BFI website. What do they do? What do they look at? What's their goal for?
So we've tried to make the website, we redesigned it a couple of years, and we tried to make it serve a couple purposes, and one is to be a good entry point for anyone that Googles Buckminster Fuller, so maybe they heard about him totally randomly, or they know a little bit, or they know nothing, and because we were one of the first hits on Google, we wanted to be a sort of a good starting point to find out about Buckminster Fuller. So we have a lot of basic information on there about Bucky, as well as some sort of tunnels and to get more deep in there. There's a lot of resources, some online books, so you can read, entire books on there. There's
the operating manual for Spaceship Earth on there.
Yeah, that's on there, and I think one or two others. So there's a ton of resources. There's also some of his other books are online, posted on different websites. So we try to make it as clear as possible. The issue is that when dealing with Fuller's work, it's so, how should I say, all over the place that it's hard to...
He spoke in a stream of consciousness.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to organize it in a really easy-to-navigate, coherent fashion. So that was part of the challenge with making the website. But aside from that, we also try, as a nonprofit, we use the website to get people involved in our programs and educate them about what we're doing now to further Fuller's design ideas.
Talk a little bit about the programs, the Buckminster Fuller Challenge. I know that's a really big program. You actually had it last month early.
Absolutely. So the Buckminster Fuller Challenge is the main program we've been running for the past 5 years, and it's an award that we give out to anyone who has a comprehensive solution to a pressing global problem, and that could be stuff dealing with climate, education, health, poverty, architecture, anything. And so what we really look for is a problem, a solution to multiple problems at once. So that, if, for instance, you submitted an idea that was a car that got 1,000 miles per gallon, that might be a great breakthrough, but we want to see how that actually affects something else aside from just fuel efficiency. So we look at problems that, we want to see that because in Fuller's vision, everything was kind of interrelated, and so that's the main thing with the challenge is that it's about comprehensive design. So we want to be tackling multiple issues at once.
Can you tell us a little bit about the winners?
The specifics,
who are some of the
absolutely.
winners, and what did they win for?
Right. So we've had 5 years and 5 winners, and it's a $100,000 prize to the winners. So it's it can be really beneficial to the projects. So we've had a broad range of winners. We've had for instance, a group from MIT of students won in 2009, our second year of the program, and that's kind of interesting because theirs was very technology heavy. They had developed a whole transportation system, a car that folds up and is hyper efficient.
That's awesome.
It's really, you should check it out online. A bicycle that's an electric bicycle, but it's unlike a lot of the other electric bikes on the market. You just basically replace the wheel on any bike, and you have an electric motor that powers whenever you're going downhill or whenever you pedal yourself.
That's awesome.
As well as an electric scooter, and the whole thing was designed into a sharing system, so kind of like a bike sharing system. So it had a lot of components.
What were the name of those MIT students?
It's called the Smart Cities Project.
Smart Cities?
Yeah.
Okay. That's really cool.
And you can find this all on our website. So they won one year. Then the next year we kind of had a project that was almost on a whole different scope, but it met the criteria in the same way, which I'll get to in a second. But it was a project out of Zimbabwe by a guy named Alan Savory, and he's been working for about 30 or 40 years dealing with soil and trying to reverse desertification in the grasslands of Zimbabwe. And so what he's found is that basically using a way to manage the animals on the land, the livestock, by doing it a certain way, you can prevent these grasslands that are deteriorating into deserts where there's no lush ecosystem, there's a lack of water, and so there's a whole stem of results from that is that there's poverty in the villages because they don't have a lot of food. There's no water, so they have to travel really far to get it. And there's even other issues like, domestic violence was rising because people, you get when there's no resources, it's hard to live. So he basically found that when you started figuring a way to revitalize the soil using management of animals, you could change all those problems at once.
Wow.
And there's actually little technology in the sense that we think of it. It's basically he's found a way to herd animals efficiently across the land, and that's his solution to these multiple pressing problems. And it also deals with climate change because when you have healthier soil, you can sequester carbon. So it's kind of this whole broad range of issues. And to me personally, that's a real sort of champion of the challenge because it kind of goes against the grain of sometimes what people think about Buckminster Fuller as a real futurist, science-heavy or technology-heavy guy, and really he was interested in using technology in certain facets, but really what he was after was solving major world problems. So
that's a very good point. So a couple people who have criticisms about the approach that the Zeitgeist movement takes, that Buckminster Fuller takes, they often say that what it seems like is that you demand a necessity for artificial intelligence. You demand technology at these grand scales.
Right.
Give some thoughts about how Buckminster Fuller was really considering how looking at the Earth outside of just the conception of artificial intelligence, but how to actually manage the Earth's resources. Well,
like you just said there, Fuller was really concerned about the Earth as one finite resource, and he used this metaphor as it being a ship, a Spaceship Earth is what he called it. And so that when you think about the planet as like a ship on the ocean, you have a finite amount of resources that you have to use, and everyone has to work together as a crew to make that ship go in the direction you want it to. So Fuller was, he was very interested in the larger scale of how the universe works. But he wasn't, on that sort of wavelength of thinking that we got to go out to other planets or, advance to a point where, we're not dealing with natural resources. He was very concerned about how we can work together comprehensively as a planet to solve the problems we have here and make ourselves a success on this planet. So,
in regards to talking to get people to look in that direction, Buckminster Fuller was quoted as once saying he never tried to persuade people to his position. Give us some thoughts about that. How did he get his ideas to people without necessarily persuading them to his position?
It's an interesting approach that he always said he had, that basically he would, instead of trying to change people's minds, he would change the environment they worked in so that they would behave differently. And, I'm not sure I agree with it 100%, but the basic idea is that, if we're living this way we're living, where we're consuming all this energy and putting a lot of, carbon in the atmosphere, and we're used to, the modern American or the modern person in the 21st century is used to being in an automobile and consuming fossil fuels and polluting the atmosphere as a result. Fuller would say, as opposed to trying to change everyone's mind, saying, no, you shouldn't be doing that, we should all be using mass transit or riding bikes or something, he would say it's much easier to actually build an effective transportation system that doesn't do that. And then you don't have to deal with how people changing their opinions about something, you change what is easy for them. So if you had a way to transport that didn't have those results, then people wouldn't, if it's easy to do, then people would do it, and you'd solve the problem without having to deal with mostly politics.
That's how he came to the idea of, I never, don't fight against the system, build a system that makes the existing system obsolete. Absolutely, yeah. So, and I think that's a really powerful thing, especially in something people are picking up now, is that the way things have been running in terms of how we run in terms of treating the planet for resources, and the whole system, monetary system, and how the corporations have kind of gotten out of control, is that you really have to change the whole system itself. And for him, it was like, if you make something new that makes the old one so obsolete, people would never consider anymore. So it's like, I'm sure there's plenty of examples of technology you could use of using a computer now versus a computer 50 years ago. But so talking about things that are obsolete, I want to talk about one thing that Buckminster Fuller said, and also getting his thoughts about the socio-economic system that we live in currently. So one of his most famous quotes is, "War is obsolete." What was his position? Why did he feel that war was obsolete?
Right. Or I think another part of the quote was, either war is obsolete or man is.
Oh, okay.
And so, for him, he felt that the whole system that war is based upon is fighting over resources, and that historically that might have made sense, but we've gotten to a point with the development of how efficiently we can do things, provide food for everybody, provide shelter, that there's not, when we really analyze it, there's not a lack of resources in the world. And so there's no need to fight over resources. So that was basically his whole thing, is that war is something that should have been left, back in the past century, but we still kept it with us. So for him, it was basically, there's no resources to fight over. Yet we still have, but he was still very cognizant of the fact that there's power structures in play that control those resources. Yeah,
he said that there's a planet of 4 billion billionaires on the planet. They just they're ignorant of their riches. Or something like that.
Right, and that gets to like his idea of what wealth actually is. And for him, he would say, another great thing he would talk about was that it would actually be more beneficial to pay people to not drive to work, because the actual true cost of oil and gasoline, it's taken millions of years for that to form. It should be worth much more than just a couple of dollars. Okay. Right.
So he was saying that it would, and that was one thing I was always confused at when I was reading the book. He's saying that people make more money in terms of Earth's resources by driving to work. They burn more money driving to work than what they actually make once they get there.
Right. Okay. Because the question is, what are people producing at their job? Well, they're not really. You can't compare that to a million-year process that the Earth has made to produce
That's incredible,
oil.
Actually.
So I don't know, but it's just kind of a reframing of the issue in terms of our resources and what wealth actually is.
So, talking about the socioeconomic system, Buckminster Fuller, well, the interesting thing is that Buckminster Fuller was, let me see, what did I get here? He received numerous accolades. He had many positions of influence in academia and in science. He was even awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Ronald Reagan, no less. And yet he was completely against nation sovereignty. He had all of these positions that were very anti-capitalist, very anti these, like, not necessarily anti, but just that he had a system that he said was better than the current system.
Right.
Yet he was completely respected by everyone who lived in these power structures.
Well, kind of. I wouldn't say he was completely.
Not completely, but he had
yeah.
a lot of influence in these arenas.
Right, and it's you kind of get to actually an interesting, almost paradox of his life as well. Is that he was, on one hand, a big critic of the war machine and the military. At the same time, he had contracts with the military to do housing stuff because that was, kind of the cutting edge. And actually, the military, specifically the Navy, had a huge influence on his whole trajectory and design because he saw how efficient the Navy could be with resources and technologies. They said, wow, if we can operate a ship that efficiently, why can't we do housing that way?
Yeah.
So it's kind of an interesting thing in terms of his relationship to the political system or mass media. And on one hand, he said, politics is a complete waste of time. He suggested, he took politicians on a spaceship and send them around, and we'd be able to solve the problems a lot better. But at the same time, he did, a lot of institutions, mostly academic, recognized his achievements, stuff like that. He never actually graduated from, he got kicked out of Harvard twice. When he was younger, and was later a visiting professor there. So he received something like 50 honorary degrees from different universities. So it's kind of the aura of Buckminster Fuller.
What were his thoughts about the socioeconomic system? Did he think that we could change things from within the paradigm, or did he think that we needed a completely new paradigm?
He would be in favor of a new paradigm.
Okay.
One of the last books he wrote before he passed away in the early 80s was this book called Grunge of Giants, and it's pretty interesting because it's all about basically framing corporations as the modern day pirates of how they control the resources and divide, steal from other people and stuff like that. And so for him, the economic issue was that there's a power structure and the corporations have too much control and that need to be curtailed some way. And so, I'm not clear if he, was specifically outlined a plan as to how to change that, but he would definitely say that the whole thing needed a change. And
there
for me,
were some thoughts that go ahead.
Well, just for me personally, that's also one of my favorite sort of undertones of a lot of his writing. Is he sort of had an anti-corporate attitude dating back to the 1930s, really, of how wealth was controlled and distributed.
There is a great quote in Critical Path where he talks about Obnoxico.
I love that too. Obnoxico was this fake company that he envisioned. I always wanted to do more research about it, but basically he was saying that you could just make money selling stuff that has no actual purpose, but if you marketed it well enough, it'd be successful. And he could have made lots of money if he'd started this company years ago. And he basically described it as selling stuff like lawn flamingos and any sort of stuff you see in airports that don't really serve a whole lot of purpose. But
I think I saw one of his examples. He said, I could get moms to give me their firstborn's diapers when they were first born, like their very first diapers. Send them to me. I could put them in some type of base metallic and then send it back to them, and they'd frame it, and I would make tons of money off of this completely waste of everything.
I think it's really funny too that he was kind of thinking that way before I don't know, the market, because a lot of this ridiculous stuff that people buy and the whole trend of consumerism, to buy more and more, he was really a critic of, and that's not really something he was well known for, but I think it's a great result. And it almost kind of reminds me of something like the whole Noxico thing, like something like the Yes Men would do, just like kind of showing how ridiculous the system that we live in is. So, it's a funny. Noxico's a funny side.
So while he was in his prime, everything that he was doing, actually he was always in his prime. He almost died in his prime basically. But what were some of his practical achievements? Some of the things that he actually built that were in full form showing.
Right. So, he's most known for the geodesic dome work, which really took off in the 50s. He developed it in the late 40s at Black Mountain College, and in the 50s it really spurred as a structure, and he set up a number of companies, and he did the patents, and then he opened up all of his patents too for the public. So there was a lot of people building domes throughout the 50s and 60s, and I'm not sure they really reached the level that he expected. Dome housing never really took off. To this day, it's still sort of a more counterculture sort of thing to live in a dome house. But they found a lot of purpose for domes doing. Obviously he did a lot of pavilions, sports stadiums, and these larger structures. So he definitely had an impact with domes. There's hundreds of thousands of them across the world. But it's something too that he's a little bit criticized of in terms of practical achievements, because he had so many inventions he was working on, and one after another never really took off for one reason or another. I would say his real impact is not a single invention, although he had some of his engineering stuff and architectural working on these space frame structures had a big impact on architecture, and even these tensegrity ideas. It wasn't so much a specific invention, how you can point to any sort of other famous inventor.
Albert Einstein with EMC. And all
right,
that.
Or someone who's doing like a practical invention, so it's like Marconi, the radio, or these other people you can point to a specific invention.
Like Thomas Edison and the light bulb.
You're right. I mean, Thomas Edison always had tons, but it's interesting, and I've noticed Buckminster Fuller is not in the Inventors Hall of Fame, and which is kind of interesting, because when I think of like inventors, I'm like, Bucky, man, like, because he had the spirit, he had the classic inventors just constantly, tirelessly working on new ideas to make things better. But he's not in the Inventors Hall of Fame, and I never really done a lot of research as to why, but my feeling is that because he doesn't have this one sole invention that we see everywhere today. You know what I mean? Because you see stuff today, the air conditioner, like Willis Carrier, that's who did it. You know what I mean? Like everything you kind of look at, you can point to a couple people as that's their trademark. But for me, getting back to what I was saying earlier, Bucky's his main lasting impact, it was not a specific invention, but more this criteria and this influence of ideas that the world we're living in is really inefficient, and it doesn't have to be that way, and we can change it through smart design and efficient use of resources. So, and that kind of gets into what the challenge is about. So if I can go back to the challenge.
Go ahead.
So I referenced earlier the criteria we have for the challenge, and I think it's really great about it is it's kind of it's called the Buckminster Fuller Challenge, but it's almost like Buckminster Fuller's challenge to himself. That we distilled this criteria that we believe was sort of driving his own design process, and so it's to bullet point it, the projects that we're looking for, and this kind of decides who are the winners and the finalists and the runners up every year. Is a project that's comprehensive, like I said, so that we're dealing with multiple problems at once, so that there's a whole systems approach. You're not just dealing with carbon in the atmosphere. You got to deal with social issues, economic issues, all of that.
Systems theory.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a little different too. That there's been more of a movement towards doing interdisciplinary work, and that's kind of similar. But it's not just bridging disciplines by getting a biologist to work with an engineer.
Exactly.
It's really having someone who is both a biologist and an engineer. You know what I mean? So
can you talk a little bit about that concept of moving away from specialization to generalization?
Absolutely.
And tie it back into the challenge?
Yeah. So Bucky was really a huge opponent to specialization, and he refused to be called any sort of one title. He didn't want to be an architect or an engineer, all this stuff. And he thought that kind of what had created a lot of the problems. That people were working in specialized fields, and that in order to solve the problems, which are all interrelated, you had to be an interrelated designer in a sense. So you had to be what he called like comprehensive anticipatory design sciences, which is really a mouthful. But basically,
I love how he writes with a million hyphens in everything that he says.
It's pretty entertaining. But basically, that you can't just be in one field. You really got to be aware of how it's this idea of how you're going to solve a problem, and if the problems are interrelated and comprehensive,
then your thinking needs to be.
Then your thinking needs to be, exactly. So that's the main criteria we look for with the challenge. It's comprehensive, We also look for projects that are anticipatory. And this is another big part of Bucky's thinking, that he was always looking, 50 years in the future. And he'd always say, well, my projects aren't really taking off now because they're designed for 50 years from now. Again, he was really interested in a long view of how we think about the planet. We can't just think, what's going to be happening next year with climate or with the planet or with, the power structures. We got to be thinking 5 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. And that's part of the problem that's caused the state we're in, is this short-sightedness. So we really got to be thinking far into the future. So problems need to be dealing with issues that are, how is this issue going to be around in 100 years? What sort of form? Ecologically responsible projects, and that's pretty straightforward. If you submit, I don't know, a fusion project, hydrogen fusion, yet somehow it's
going to leak all over the place.
Or you get nuclear waste, or you're destroying mountains in the process. So obviously the projects we want to support have very little ecological impact. Feasible. Fuller had a handful of ideas that were not very feasible because of the scale and the amount of resources they would take. But those were to me more thinking experiments about what could be possible. But for the challenge, we look for, it's great to see projects that are really kind of pushing the limits, but we want something that's going to be feasible with technology and resources that are available. Lastly, something that's verifiable. We want to know it's actually going to work. So there's got to be some sort of, science, empirical testing behind that, and something that's replicable. And that's also a big issue, is that, Fuller dealing with the whole planet, he wasn't designing stuff that was just for, New York City or just for, a specific region. He really thought that all of his ideas and everything he worked on could be implemented everywhere. So it's pretty interesting, because we get a lot of projects that are, you can have stuff that's based in an area. For instance, I mentioned Alan Savory's been working in Zimbabwe on the land management. But what he's really working on is a system to use through the grasslands and savannas across the world. So he's also set up a nonprofit research institute in New Mexico, which obviously, like, New Mexico is a lot different than Zimbabwe in a lot of ways, but in terms of the land and the natural geographies, there's some similarities. So we look for projects that are you can sort of plug into a number of areas. So if you're working on a community garden, that's great, but you got to have that community garden as a model to put in other different places. So
important.
That's basically the Buckminster Fuller challenge criteria in an expanded nutshell.
So there's one thing that I really liked about Buckminster Fuller's work as I'm again studying through Critical Path, is his concept of the world game. And I wanted to see how that ties into the relevance today. And I know there's some teachers right now who are doing world games with kindergartners, kindergarten, fourth graders, and they're doing world peace games, trying to get them to, and they're using the Buckminster Fuller idea. So I wanted to let you.
Well, that's just a background. That's what Fuller got really, I don't want to say inspired by, but interested in the idea of war games. That this is during the Cold War era. And the U.S. government, as well as the Soviet government, just spending tremendous amount of money and resources of plotting possible scenarios of how to best defend our country and borders and all that, as well as, in an event, an attack, how we would attack back. And, all these, he really thought that was kind of interesting, that you have all these scenarios about how the future would play out. But he, again, being that he thought war was obsolete, he thought this was a real waste of resources to figure out how best to protect or attack. Instead, he proposed a world peace game, which was how can we use that same ideology of getting all the information we have available and figuring scenarios of how to make the world more successful, and also kind of getting rid of these country issues. So you're not just dealing with how to make the U.S. successful, how to make the world successful. So he spent a lot of time, he started really getting into this in the 60s, developing this idea and collecting just tremendous amounts of data. And it's kind of interesting because now the internet, you can just do this stuff so quickly, but tremendous amount of
Buckminster Fuller with the internet.
So tremendous amount of resources, and had whole teams working on amassing large amounts of data to say, like, okay, how could we better provide water for people that don't have clean water across the planet? How could we better, map transportation routes to get across the world? How could we deal with all the world problems, and how could we use all the information we have to work out different scenarios? So a big part of that was the map, the Dymaxion map, which he used.
Definitely. Talking about the map. That's a
the map is probably my favorite project that he worked on, and and primarily because when I was talking about with how you're going to solve a problem, and so he was really concerned that if we're going to start solving global problems, and Bucky was really one of the first pioneers to start thinking on a global scale. It's like not something's happening across the world in China. It's part of our problem as well.
Absolutely,
because we're all connected. Whereas the 19th century was. Everything was so far away, before the airplane and the automobile, so everything was worlds away.
Buckminster Fuller famously wore 3 watches, so because he could travel so much.
He traveled so much,
had that world of view and
all the time zones
connected to himself.
Yeah, absolutely. So the map was his started from really saying, if we're going to work on global problems, we need to have an accurate representation of the globe itself on a 2-dimensional scale. And so that most of the maps that people still use are largely distorted. So, we look at a modern map of the world and we'll see, Greenland is, 3 times larger than it actually is, and all these really inconsistencies. And also continents, Antarctica is split up, like it doesn't actually show it as a landmass. It looks like, some maps you have like Asia is so far away from North America because of the way it's divided. And so Fuller,
they're much closer than most people actually realize.
Than we might think. So Fuller wanted to find a way to accurately depict the actual geography of the sphere onto a 2-dimensional plane. And so it actually kind of corresponds with a lot of geodesic dome work that he was using this Platonic geometry to project that. And so the Dymaxion map was basically has there's distortion, but the distortion is completely equal across the globe. So you can look at it and say, like, oh, wow, I didn't actually realize how close this area was to us, or that this landmass is actually this size. And so if we're going to start, like I said, solving global problems, we need an accurate representation of what we're dealing with, or else it's, it's like how are you going to drive somewhere if the map you're using is wrong. So that was really the main part about his map. There was other things that are kind of interesting too. He never delineated political boundaries on any of the maps he made. It was always he put in cities and populations, but he never identified the United States because he thought the country lines would be obsolete in a number of years.
So we use the word Dymaxion.
Yeah.
A lot of people, when they see Buckminster Fuller, they see that word immediately, but it's not in any dictionary. So what does it mean?
Dymaxion was a term that came from around 1930 when he started working on his first projects for housing, and so he invented this, drew up a proposal for what he called the 4D house, and 4D referring to the 4th dimension, because he really thought that we build architecture in 3 dimensions, but he was so inspired by Einstein and all his stuff, he thought, we got to start thinking about how time influences us. And so his first housing units were called the 4D house. And around this time, he was in Chicago and later in New York, and he was going around and he had a model of the 4D house and was kind of showing it to people. And they had an ad man started following him around and created this word Dymaxion because he thought it'd be better selling point than the 4D house. And Dymaxion comes from 3 words, which Bucky was always saying, which was dynamic, maximum, and tension. And so because that's a lot of his design principles, that you're doing maximum, you're doing the most amount of good with the least amount of resources. And tension, he was really interested in how you can use tension, and the house itself was kind of almost like a suspended structure. So it wasn't bricks stacked up on top of bricks, it was using like a mast on a sailboat to suspend the house. So
that's awesome.
He was always throughout his career playing with these ideas of tension and compression. So Dymaxion was something this ad man came up with, and Bucky liked it so much that he just used it for
everything.
For pretty much everything. A lot of it, he had a Dymaxion the house, he had a Dymaxion car, the Dymaxion map. Dymaxion bathroom. I mean, there's just loads of stuff.
He was known for just making up words. Whenever he would have, he would start thinking about something and say, you know what, I'll just make up a word for that.
And this gets back to the math as well. This idea that if we're gonna solve problems or move forward, even on an intellectual level, we need to start using words that actually make sense. So he would always kind of challenge the normal language that we've grown up with and we're so accustomed to. So he had real issues with, so he would basically use words he thought were more appropriate. So for instance, he had real issues with the words up and down. And because basically the idea of up and down comes from when we thought the world was flat. So everything is either up or it's down. You know, the heavens are above us and hell's below us and everything else is out to the side. So we walk up the stairs or we walk down the stairs. And but Bucky would say, you know, there's real no up and down. We're really just we're on a planet that is floating around a solar system with no up or down relationship at all. You know, who's to say that right now, you know, we're in New York City, that we still feel like the sky above us is up. But for someone on the opposite side of the planet, that up is in the opposite direction. So he had a real issue with the words up and down, and he instead would say in and out. You know, that's a more accurate representation of how the universe works. You can be in towards the center of something, or you can be out from it. So he would actually say, you know, I'm walking outstairs when he was climbing flights of stairs, or I'm walking in stairs and stuff like that. So the same thing with sunset. He would say, you know, we've known for hundreds of years that the sun doesn't actually set. It's just the planet revolving. You know, we still use this terminology. So it gets back to his thinking that, you know, if we're gonna move forward, we can't be using this outdated terminology and language. So he would just make something, you know, he would use what he thought was more appropriate. And like you said, he made up words for all sorts of stuff.
What were his thoughts about universe?
He was really, it's a huge question. He always said that he would start with universe as the main, you know, design point, is to see how things work on a larger scale, and then apply that to everyday problems. So, you know, basically he was, you know, there's something real spiritual about it, that he would look at the design that nature uses and try to replicate that, or not replicate, but really understand those principles and use it in his own work. So in terms of universe, you made a good point to not say the universe, but she had another language issue with, which is that we know only one universe. So to say the implies that there's multiple, the same way that we don't say, you know, I prayed to the God today. Most people that believe in one God say, I prayed to God. You know, so but universe is something that was constantly in his writing, and you know, he had a great sense of imagination and curiosity about how things work on a cosmic scale. So that's
for someone who is so science-based and so skeptical, he still had a firm belief in a God. He believed that there was a God. How did he orient that with his scientific thinking, and how did he have that scientific explanation for God?
Right. Well, for him, it was, you know, his thinking of God was this order. You know, the tremendous amount of order that he saw in nature and universe. So it wasn't. I'm gonna have a tough time answering this question. It wasn't a thinking of God in most, you know, Western religion sort of sense, but for him it was a higher order, that there was a higher power to all this, and that, you know, everything that he was working on in terms of science was based on that order. So I'm not sure if that answers the question.
No, that's a good answer. Let me just pause this really quick. So Buckminster Fuller is quoted as saying, "I seem to be a verb." What did he mean by that?
So I seem to be a verb, which was also a book he wrote in the 60s, which is really great. But the whole idea behind that was that there's no, for him, he didn't really think of himself as a fixed state, or even objects in a fixed state. He was really interested in these processes and patterns. So he would think of, you know, he'd even talk about our physical bodies as, you know, we're not the same person we were when we were younger. All of our cells that compose us right now have died off, so that we're a process. We're not a an actual, like a product or a specific object. It's a process of how life works.
Yeah, he said that when we would eat, we would take on those characteristics of the food that we had.
Right.
But by the time, like about 30 days later, all of that would be gone, and whatever we ate had now become a part of us. So he was saying we were always moving in that sense.
Yeah, so it's this idea of patterns, and he was really interested in that as well. And he would talk about knots and rope and do these demonstrations. A knot is not really an object; it's just a pattern that's going through the rope, and the whole planet, in a sense. That everything is a pattern and a process that's going through. That nothing is in a fixed state. So I don't know if that answers your question.
That's a great answer. So, what were Buckminster Fuller's thoughts on utopia? There's a great quote that the movement talks about often. We say that there is no utopia, there are no final stages. And I'm sure Buckminster Fuller had that similar thoughts on that.
No, it's an interesting point. I think, sometimes he gets, categorized as being a total utopist. And he obviously was, a lot of his projects were in that realm of putting forth these, possible physical landscapes that seemed very utopian. But in a sense, he was basically saying that there's a much better world possible, and it's possible right now if we adjust our attitudes, the way we solve problems and stuff like that. So, in terms of you could make the case for him being a utopist visionary, but I sort of take that stuff with a grain of salt. Some of those larger projects, I think they're really interesting from a more of an inspirational point of view.
Yeah.
I'm not really convinced that he really thought we should all be living in domes floating around the sky and stuff like that. But it was more of like an idea of what's actually possible, what we could be doing if we wanted to. So, yeah.
So one of the final things Buckminster Fuller did before he passed was an Everything I Know session, where he sat down and he just went through it. Can you talk a little bit about that? If you've seen the entire thing?
No, I haven't seen the entire thing. Everything I Know was a video recording that's 42 hours long that was shot over the course of 3 days. And Bucky was really well known for his lengthy lectures, beginning really in the 60s, throughout the 70s. So for about the last 20 years of his life, that was one of his main things, was that he went around to different college campuses and institutions across the world and would lecture. And he never planned out a lecture. It was always, spontaneous, thinking out loud is what he would call it. And the lectures were, they're very well known for being 4 hours minimum, and just him talking the whole time, and so it's really cool, because a big part of that was that he was thinking, again, with this education, if we're going to change the way we do stuff, we got to start changing our frame of mind. So he wanted to get out, and especially with the young people. I think it's kind of interesting, because in the late 60s he became this kind of counterculture figure for, say, like the hippie movement, and he would go to these college campuses where 19 and 20-year-olds, and here you have Buckminster Fuller, who's 70 years old at that point, and this, small, old-school-looking guy with a bow tie, and almost could be a symbol of the system that a lot of people were really fighting. But he was able to transcend that sort of superficial characteristic and connect with this, totally opposite, a new generation. But to get back to 42 hours, the Everything I Know was a video recording, and you can see a lot of it online. The whole transcript is on our website. And it's just him laying out, his master lecture in a sense. But
So, considering the 60s in terms of social change, we're right back into that moment. Occupy Wall Street's coming out. The Zeitgeist movement is coming out. All of these different, actually very, very young movements in the sense of they're from 17 to 26, these people, basically saying, we want to see differences. And Buckminster Fuller actually had a perspective on people going out and challenging the system head first, meaning that jumping out, letting their heads become like beating boards. And he had a thought for what they were doing, and he wanted to get them to start thinking in different ways. What were some of those things?
I mean, like I said, like going to the campuses and really getting people to change the system. I think it is like really appropriate that a lot of that, the same mentality in a sense from the 60s is coming back again now, and that also for me, it's really interesting to see the younger generation sort of rediscovering Bucky in a lot of ways. That it's not the same way people from the 60s knew Bucky. He's sort of this older figure that, like, wow, he had a lot of really interesting ideas about how to change the system. And, we don't have to all live in domed houses to do that, but it's sort of this courageous attack on the systems in place. So if that answers your question, I think it was this sort of proactive approach to changing the situation.
Did he feel that it was important to protest, or did he have a different perspective on how to create or generate social change?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I don't know if I can appropriately answer it. There might be some other people out there, but I would say, he definitely, he was never a protest leader per se, but he was very involved in all of the social happenings of that time. So I think he definitely felt that was a great thing to happen. But, again, since so many protests are kind of politically driven, he might also feel in the same hand that we just need to find a new system entirely that will replace that political system. And to me, I think that's interesting as well as, does the protest model, does that need to be replaced with something else? And I think that's something maybe people are trying to evaluate. Can we protest issues the same way people did in the 60s and 70s and have it be effective? What's the new model that's going to make that obsolete? I think it's kind of an interesting question to think about, and I don't really have an answer at all. But
so far you're doing good. So there's a couple last things that I wanted to talk about. One, the final thing on social change is that there's a lot of people out who feel, in some senses, powerless against the entire system. They have a lot of information about what could be, but they don't really understand what they were. But on Bucky's gravestone, he wanted to let people know something finally, and he said that he said, I'm a trim tab. If I'm saying that correctly.
Call me trim tab.
Call me trim tab. What's a trim tab?
So trim tab is, we actually use that with a challenge a lot as a metaphor too. A trim tab specifically refers to the part of a rudder on a ship that helps steer the rudder and the whole ship. And so it's basically, the metaphor is a very small part or component that can change the navigation of a very large structure or organization. And so Bucky himself thought of himself as a trim tab as this one individual. And he even talked about how his whole life was kind of this experiment to see what one person could do. And so for him, he was a trim tab to try to be that one person that can cause a great shift. And so with the challenge, we look for projects that are, one, say, small project, may not really be small, but something that seems small that can really create a huge sea change into the navigation. And so, getting back to this idea of how I think that's something that's really inspiring about Bucky to this day is that, that idea of like, I'm just one person. You can either look at that as like, I'm only one person, there's huge power structures in place, what can I do? Nothing. Or you can look at it as like, I'm one person, I can do anything I want to, it sounds kind of cheesy, but, like what can one person do? And a challenge to yourself to see what kind of impact you can have on guiding a larger system. So, and his whole story about how he lived his life is trying to be this one experiment of a person, I think is really inspiring.
Because he comes from this background where he was about to kill himself.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of almost made it through here without avoiding the big story of Bucky. And so basically he really became himself and started producing all this work at the age of 32. And the story goes that in 1927, he was going to take his own life on the shores of Lake Michigan. He was working at the company, taking over the company that his father-in-law started, and it had run into the ground, so he felt really burdened as being a failed businessman. He couldn't provide for his family. His first daughter had died a few years earlier. He just had a new daughter, Allegra, who helped start the Institute here in New York as well.
Miss Snyder, right?
Yeah. And so he felt like he was a failure. He couldn't do anything with his life, and that his family, his newborn daughter and his wife Anne would be better out without him. And so he was going to go take his own life, and then upon this moment he had this sort of epiphany, this revelation moment of that his life wasn't his own to take, that it belonged to the universe, to something greater. and that he would sacrifice everything, that he would try to dispel everything he'd ever learned about what it means to be successful. So he would never again try to work for money. So it's already from that instance sort of challenging the capitalist system in a sense, and that he would say, I'm never again going to work for money. I'm going to work for bettering the planet and bettering humanity. And that was the beginning.
He was in his 30s. Most people would say that's the twilight of life. Yeah, he was
30
when he
32
began.
years old. Yeah.
Exactly.
So for everybody under 32, you still got plenty of time. But it's really interesting because if he did, if he would have committed suicide at that point, no one would have any idea who he was. He was just a regular businessman type guy, and it was really from that point that he became the person we know today. This guy who just never slept and was constantly working on dozens of projects at a time, trying to make the world a better place. So to me, I think it's really it's an interesting story, and it kind of has these mythical qualities of it. But the idea is really, I got really excited about it when I first started reading about it. Just like, why can't people take on their lives as an experiment and challenge, the sort of system they've always lived with?
So final thing for people, actually two final things for people who just become interested, just learning about Buckminster Fuller, the Zeitgeist movement, design science, these bigger concepts. How do they go about, instead of not feeling like they're isolated from thinking that there's a small nucleus, but that there are other organizations, other people who are talking about this? And then I guess, how do we bridge those gaps between people so that they can see how you have the Buckminster Fuller, you have the Venus Project, you have Will McDonough, Cradle to Cradle technology. How do you see those connecting so that we can all have those shared conversations?
It's a really great question. I'm not sure what the specific answer is, but I do think that as all of these sort of organizations you mentioned, whether they be design and architecture, social, health, whatever, that they are growing and there's getting a lot of attention. And once people start getting interested in one, I don't know if the solution is a comprehensive network of all of the leading people or organizations, but I think it's just people just need to do as much as they can to learn about what's happening and get involved at whatever level they can. So obviously it depends where you are and what you're doing, but to sort of take that Bucky initiative to try something new and not be afraid of the failure. I think that's a big thing that Bucky sort of he really liked failure in a sense that he said there's no such thing as a failure. Everything's a learning process. So I think that's also a very inspirational thing that you can't learn less. You can only learn more. So it's a good idea to try new things and involve yourself with other people. So it's not a direct answer to your question, but
it's a good one.
I think there's a lot of different these small communities that are forming. So
that's good.
Get out there.
So for people who are in New York City or visit New York City and they're interested in Buckminster Fuller, how can they come by the Buckminster Fuller Institute, and what would they gain from coming to the Institute?
Right. So we have a small study center here, and people can send an email and come by. And like I said, the main archives are at Stanford, but we have a handful of resources, old books. So if people want to talk specifically about Buckminster Fuller, definitely stop by. You can check out videos and stuff like that. In terms of getting involved with the Institute, a lot of the Institute, we're based here. A lot of the work we do is on a international scale, really. So staying tuned to events, we do like we said, the Buckminster Fuller Challenge conferring ceremony every year is our big event, but we do a number of other events throughout the year. Some here in the space. We do some at Pioneers Conference, sort of throughout. So. Really just sign up for our email list, and check
BFI.org, right?
BFI.org, and check out upcoming events. And really, I'd also, the challenge has been such an incredible resource of information. We just have all these really awesome people that are submitting projects to it. So I highly recommend people check out the challenge as well. So, it's kind of there's the BFI does the, serving as an information clearinghouse about Buckminster Fuller, but, we're also really trying to take it further and do projects like the challenge that are influenced by Bucky but are really sort of their own thing as well. So there's a lot going on.
Sounds good. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
So I want to thank the Buckminster Fuller Institute one more time for their time. Thank Will for his time. Thank you all for checking in. I'll leave you with the intro again as my outro. Have a good day, guys.
People say to me, I wonder what it'd be like to be on a spaceship. And I say to you, you don't really realize what you're doing. Because everybody is an astronaut. You all live aboard a beautiful little spaceship called Earth. I think that with some final examination as to whether human beings, the promise lies should take on the responsibility of a design to be entrusted with. And this is not a matter of examination of the types of governments, nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with the economic system. It's to do with the individual. Does the individual have the courage to really go along with the truth? I'm not trying to imitate nature. I'm trying to find the principles she's using. You're going to find out what needs to be done. How do you organize yourself to accommodate going from 1% of humanity to 99% of humanity who are now going to have to live? And that is the design responsibility. Therefore, the only way we can possibly take care of everybody is through a design revolution, doing more with less. How do we, within that big context, find out how we use our mind, our experience, and to its highest advantage for the others in the shortest possible time? That was a challenge. Feasible to take care of all of humanity at a higher standard of living without having anybody profit at the expense of another, so everybody can enjoy the whole earth.